Giant albino deer begged humans to help her give birth. What happened next was beyond belief. The morning fog hung thick over the forested foothills of the Cascade Range, clinging to the pine branches like gauze soaked in silver light. It was mid-April, and the air smelled of wet earth and new growth. Daniel Reeves had been a wildlife ranger in this corner of Washington state for nearly 20 years, and he'd seen plenty. Black bears foraging through campsites, cougars trailing hikers from a distance, even a pair of wolves reintroduced to the region just last winter. But nothing in his 2 decades of service had prepared him for what happened that morning. He was patrolling the access road near Clearwater Creek when his radio crackled. It was Marissa Cole, a seasonal volunteer stationed at the visitor center about 4 miles east. "Daniel, you there?" Her voice was tight, urgent. "Copy. What's going on? If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. I don't know how to explain this. There's a deer, a huge one, white, like completely white. She's standing just outside the center, and she won't leave. She keeps staring at the door. I think something's wrong." Daniel frowned, slowing his truck to a crawl. Albino deer were rare, but not unheard of in the region. Most didn't survive long. Bright coats made them easy targets for predators. But the behavior Marissa described didn't sound right. "Is she injured?" "I don't think so. But Daniel, she's acting strange. She's not running. She just keeps looking at me like she wants me to follow her." There was a long pause. Daniel could hear the uncertainty in Marissa's voice, the tremor of someone who knew how absurd it sounded, but couldn't shake what she was seeing. "Stay put," he said finally. "I'm 10 minutes out." He pushed the accelerator down and wound through the forest road, branches scraping the sides of his truck. The fog was starting to lift, revealing patches of pale blue sky. His mind turned over the possibilities. Injury, disease, disorientation. Animals didn't ask for help, not in any rational sense. But every once in a while, something happened that defied the textbook. He'd heard stories from other rangers. A dolphin leading fishermen to a trapped calf. A dog refusing to leave a collapsed hiker until rescuers arrived. Instinct, desperation, he didn't know. But he knew better than to dismiss it outright. When he arrived at the visitor center, Marissa was standing on the gravel lot, arms crossed, her breath visible in the cool air. And there, not 20 feet away, stood the deer. Daniel stepped out slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The deer turned her head toward him. She was enormous, easily one of the largest does he'd ever seen, probably close to 200 pounds. Her coat was the color of fresh snow, unmarked except for a faint dusting of dirt along her legs. Her eyes were pale pink, glassy and wide, reflecting the morning light. She didn't bolt. She didn't even flinch. "Jesus," Daniel muttered under his breath. Marissa stepped closer, her voice low. "She's been here for over half an hour. I tried to shoo her off. She won't move." Daniel studied the animal. Her breathing was labored, her flanks heaving, her belly was distended, swollen in a way that told him everything he needed to know. "She's pregnant," he said quietly. Marissa's eyes widened. "Oh my God!" The deer took a step forward, then another. She moved with a slow, deliberate gait, her head lowered slightly, as though she were approaching something fragile. She stopped just a few feet from Daniel and let out a low, guttural sound. Not quite a bleat, more like a groan. Daniel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "She's in labor," he said. Marissa stiffened. "What do we do?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His training told him to keep his distance, to let nature take its course. But something about the way the deer was looking at him, her eyes locked on his, unblinking, pleading, made his chest tighten. "Get Dr. Lanning on the phone," he said. "Tell her we need her here, now." Dr. Evelyn Lanning was a veterinarian who worked out of a small clinic in the nearby town of Ridgefield. She specialized in wildlife rehabilitation and had a reputation for taking on cases no one else would touch. When Marissa reached her, Evelyn didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 15, she said, and the line went dead. Daniel stayed near the deer, speaking softly, his voice steady. He didn't know if it made any difference, but it felt like the right thing to do. Marissa stood a few paces back, her phone clutched in both hands, recording everything. The deer's breathing grew more ragged. She lowered herself onto the gravel, her legs folding beneath her. A low, keening sound escaped her throat. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the deer or to himself. "Help's coming." When Evelyn's truck pulled up, she was out before the engine even stopped. She was a small woman in her mid-40s, with short grey hair and hands that moved with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime handling delicate things. She took one look at the deer and nodded grimly. "She's in distress," Evelyn said, kneeling beside the animal. "This isn't normal labor. Something's wrong." Daniel crouched next to her. "Can you help her?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I can try." Evelyn worked quickly, her hands moving over the deer's swollen belly with practiced gentleness. The animal flinched but didn't try to flee. Her pink eyes followed Evelyn's every movement, and Daniel could have sworn he saw something beyond pain in that gaze, something closer to trust. "Her heart rate's elevated," Evelyn murmured, pressing her stethoscope against the deer's chest. "And the fawn's positioned wrong. I can feel it. Breach, maybe worse." Marissa's voice came from behind them, thin and worried. "Will she make it?" Evelyn didn't look up. "Not without intervention. And even with it," she trailed off, her mouth set in a hard line. "I need to get her back to the clinic. I don't have the equipment here." Daniel shook his head. "She won't survive the transport. Not in this condition." "Then we do it here," Evelyn said flatly. She stood and walked back to her truck, returning with a canvas bag filled with supplies, gloves, sterile drapes, syringes, bottles of antiseptic. "I've delivered calves in worse places. This isn't much different." But it was different, and they all knew it. Wild deer didn't let humans touch them, let alone perform emergency obstetrics on gravel lots. Yet here this animal was, lying still, as though she understood that these strangers were her only chance. As Evelyn prepared, Daniel found himself thinking about the first time he'd heard about the white deer. It had been 3 years ago during a community meeting about wildlife conservation. An older man, a retired logger named Carl Whitmore, had stood up and told a story that most people dismissed as folklore. "I seen her," Carl had said, his voice gravelly and certain. "Up near Harmon Ridge. A ghost deer, white as winter. She watched me for near 10 minutes, didn't run. Felt like she was studying me, like she knew something I didn't." People had chuckled politely. Albino animals attracted myths the way lightning rods attracted storms. But Carl hadn't smiled. "Mark my words," he'd said. "That deer's special. You see her, you treat her right." Daniel had filed the story away as harmless superstition. But over the following years, more sightings trickled in. Hikers glimpsed her near the creek beds. A photographer captured a blurred image of her silhouette against the sunrise. She became something of a local legend, the white ghost of Clearwater, some called her. Most assumed she wouldn't survive her first winter. Predators, hunters, the simple cruelty of standing out in a world that rewarded camouflage. But she had survived. And now, here she was, vulnerable and desperate, trusting the very species that posed the greatest threat to her kind. "Daniel," Evelyn's voice snapped him back to the present. "I need you to hold her steady. She's going to panic when I start." He moved to the deer's head, kneeling in the gravel. He placed one hand gently on her neck, feeling the rapid thrum of her pulse beneath the fur. Her breathing was shallow now, labored. She turned her head slightly, and for a moment their eyes met. "I've got you," Daniel whispered. "We've got you." Evelyn pulled on a pair of long gloves, her expression grim and focused. Marissa stood nearby, pale but determined, holding a flashlight even though the sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the fog. "Marissa," Evelyn said, "I need you to keep that light steady. And Daniel, no matter what happens, don't let her thrash. If she tries to stand, it could kill the fawn, maybe her too. Daniel nodded, his throat dry. Evelyn began. The process was slow and excruciating. Evelyn's hands disappeared inside the birth canal, her face tight with concentration. The deer let out a sound that Daniel would never forget, a high, keening wail that seemed to carry all the pain and fear of every living thing that had ever struggled to bring life into the world. "Easy," Daniel murmured, his hand stroking the deer's neck. "Easy, girl. You're doing so good." Sweat beaded on Evelyn's forehead despite the cool air. "The fawn's stuck. Front legs are folded back. I need to reposition." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Marissa's hands shook, the flashlight beam wavering. Daniel's knees ached from kneeling on the gravel, but he didn't move. He kept his hand on the deer, kept his voice low and steady, a lifeline in the chaos. "Got it," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice sharp with relief. "I've got the legs. Now we just need—" The deer convulsed, her body seizing with a contraction so powerful that Daniel had to throw his weight across her shoulders to keep her down. "Now!" Evelyn shouted. "She's pushing! Come on, Mama, you can do this!" The deer's cry split the morning air, raw and primal, and then, in a rush of fluid and membrane, something slid free into Evelyn's waiting hands. For a moment, no one breathed. The fawn lay motionless in Evelyn's arms, a tiny, crumpled thing covered in birth sac. Its coat was pale, not quite as white as its mother's, but close. A soft, creamy color, like sun-bleached bone. "Is it?" Marissa's voice broke. Evelyn didn't answer. She wiped the membrane away from the fawn's face, cleared its nostrils, and began rubbing its chest vigorously with a towel. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Daniel felt his heart sink. They'd been too late. The breech birth, the stress, the delay. It had been too much, but Evelyn didn't stop. She bent down, placed her mouth over the fawn's tiny muzzle, and breathed. 1 breath, 2, 3. The fawn's ribcage fluttered. Evelyn pulled back, her eyes wide. She rubbed its chest again, harder this time, and then the fawn gasped, a wet, choking sound, and its eyes opened. Marissa let out a sob of relief, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The mother deer lifted her head, her pink eyes focusing on her newborn with an intensity that seemed to transcend instinct. Evelyn placed the fawn on the ground beside its mother, and immediately the doe began to lick it, her tongue moving in long, deliberate strokes, cleaning away the remnants of birth, stimulating circulation, welcoming her baby into the world. The fawn was weak, unsteady, but alive. It tried to lift its head, wobbled and collapsed back against its mother's belly. "She needs to nurse," Evelyn said quietly. "In the next hour, or she won't make it." As if understanding, the mother deer shifted, positioning herself so the fawn could reach her. The little one nuzzled instinctively, searching, and after several clumsy attempts, latched on. Daniel sat back on his heels, his hands shaking. He looked at Evelyn, whose face was streaked with sweat and dirt, and something that might have been tears. He looked at Marissa, who was still filming, her cheeks wet. And he looked at the white deer, who had walked out of the forest, and asked the impossible. "Why?" he said aloud, though he didn't expect an answer. "Why did she come to us?" Evelyn wiped her hands on a towel, her expression distant. "I don't know," she said softly, "but she knew, somehow, she knew we'd help." The fawn nursed for nearly 20 minutes before exhaustion overtook her. She collapsed into a small heap against her mother's side, her ribcage rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The mother deer remained perfectly still, her head lowered protectively over her baby, as though creating a shelter with her own body. Evelyn sat back on the gravel, peeling off her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline crash that followed what they'd just witnessed. She looked at Daniel, and something passed between them without words. A shared recognition that they had been part of something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. "We need to monitor them," Evelyn said finally, her voice hoarse. At least for the next few hours. The fawn's weak, and the mother's been through hell. If either of them goes into shock... I'll stay, Daniel said immediately. I'll call headquarters, tell them I'm off patrol for the rest of the day. Marissa lowered her phone, her face still flushed with emotion. I'll get some water and blankets. It might help. Evelyn nodded. Good, but keep your distance. Just because she let us help doesn't mean she's domesticated. If she feels threatened, instinct could kick in. But even as she said it, none of them truly believed the white deer would attack. There was something in the way she'd surrendered herself to their care, something that suggested a depth of understanding that shouldn't have been possible. By mid-afternoon, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the ranger network and into town. Carl Whitmore, the retired logger who'd first reported seeing the white deer years ago, arrived in a battered pickup truck, his weathered face creased with concern. A local news crew showed up, but Daniel waved them off, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "This isn't a spectacle," he said firmly. "These are wild animals in a vulnerable state. You want a story? You can wait until I say it's safe." The reporter, a young woman with a microphone and an eager cameraman, looked disappointed but didn't argue. She retreated to the edge of the parking lot, filming from a distance. Carl approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a respectful distance away and just stared at the deer, his eyes glistening. "I knew it," he said quietly. "I knew she was something special." Daniel glanced at him. "You said you saw her 3 years ago, up near Harmon Ridge." Carl nodded. "Yep, dead of winter. Snow so deep I could barely get my truck through. I was cutting firewood when I seen her, standing in a clearing like she owned the whole forest. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, but she was real, and she just watched me. Didn't run, didn't flinch, just watched." "What did you do?" Carl's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. "I tipped my hat to her, felt like the right thing to do. Then she turned and walked back into the trees, calm as you please. I told folks about it, but most thought I was full of it." He paused, his gaze never leaving the deer. "Guess she remembered." "Remembered what?" "That not all humans are bad." And as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Evelyn conducted another examination. The mother deer allowed it, though her eyes tracked every movement with wary vigilance. The fawn was still weak, but she had nursed twice more, and her breathing had steadied. "She's a fighter," Evelyn said, gently pressing her stethoscope against the fawn's tiny chest. "Heart rate's improving, but she's underweight. The birth took a lot out of both of them." Daniel crouched beside her. "Will they make it?" Evelyn hesitated, and in that hesitation, Daniel saw the weight of all the animals she'd tried to save over the years. The ones that lived, and the ones that didn't. "I don't know," she admitted. "The next 48 hours are critical. If the fawn doesn't gain strength, if the mother can't produce enough milk, nature doesn't forgive weakness. But they have a chance." "They have a chance," Evelyn echoed. "A better one than they would have had without us." As dusk settled over the forest, something shifted. The mother deer, who had been lying motionless for hours, suddenly lifted her head. Her ears swiveled forward, alert. Daniel followed her gaze toward the tree line. A shape moved in the shadows. "Everyone stay calm," Daniel said quietly, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. The shape emerged into the fading light, and Daniel's breath caught. It was a buck. Massive, with a rack of antlers that spread like twisted branches against the darkening sky. His coat was a normal tawny brown, but there was something in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, purposeful, that commanded attention. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot, 20 yards away, and stared directly at the white deer. "Is that," Marissa whispered. "The father," Evelyn breathed. "It has to be." The buck took another step forward, and Daniel tensed, unsure what to do. But the white deer made a soft sound, a low, rumbling call, and the buck stopped. For a long moment, the two animals simply looked at each other, and Daniel felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply private. Then the buck turned and melted back into the forest. Carl let out a low whistle. "He's watching over them," he said, "making sure they're safe." Daniel didn't respond, but something in his chest tightened. The white deer hadn't just come to them for help. She'd brought her entire family into the open, into the presence of humans, trusting them with the most vulnerable moment of her life. Why? That night, Daniel stayed at the visitor center. He set up a camping chair near the door and kept watch while the deer rested on the gravel lot. Marissa had gone home hours ago, exhausted and emotionally drained. Evelyn had left supplies and instructions, promising to return at dawn. The stars emerged, sharp and bright in the clear mountain sky. Daniel sat in the cold, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, the soft breathing of the deer just a few yards away. Around midnight, the fawn tried to stand. Daniel watched, his heart in his throat, as the little one's spindly legs trembled and buckled. She collapsed twice before finally finding her balance, wobbling like a sailor on a storm-tossed deck. Her mother watched, motionless but attentive. And when the fawn finally took her first shaky step, Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. "That's it," he whispered. "You've got it." The fawn took another step, then another. She made it 3 feet before her legs gave out and she tumbled back to the ground. But she had walked, and that meant she had a chance. Just before dawn, when the sky was still more black than blue, Daniel heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He turned to see Carl Whitmore approaching with 2 steaming thermoses. "Figured you could use some coffee," the old man said, handing one over. Daniel accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. "Couldn't sleep?" "Nope. Kept thinking about her, about why she came to us." Carl settled into a second chair he'd brought from his truck, his gaze on the sleeping deer. "You know, the Salish tribes used to tell stories about white animals, said they were spirit guides, messengers. You believe that?" Carl shrugged. "I believe there's things in this world we don't understand, things that don't fit in textbooks." He took a sip of his coffee. "Maybe she's just a deer with a genetic mutation, or maybe she's something more. Either way, she chose to trust us, and that means something." They sat in silence as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. And in that light, the white deer seemed to glow, ethereal and impossible, a living embodiment of hope against all odds. By the time Evelyn returned at dawn, the situation had evolved in ways none of them could have predicted. The parking lot of the visitor center had transformed into something between a wildlife sanctuary and a vigil. Daniel counted at least 15 people gathered at a respectful distance, locals mostly, people who had heard about the white deer through word of mouth or seen Marissa's footage, which had somehow made its way onto social media, despite Daniel's attempts to keep things quiet. Evelyn emerged from her truck carrying a medical bag and a portable ultrasound unit. She took one look at the crowd and shook her head. "This is going to be a problem," she said quietly to Daniel. "I know, but I can't exactly force them to leave. It's public land." "It's not the people I'm worried about," Evelyn said, kneeling beside the mother deer to begin her examination. "It's what comes after. You know how this works, Daniel. The moment this story gets bigger, and it will, we're going to have wildlife services, media circus, maybe even protesters. Everyone will have an opinion about what we should do." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. He'd seen it before. A rescued animal becomes a symbol, and suddenly everyone from animal rights activists to hunting groups wants to weigh in. The white deer would become public property in the worst way, not in terms of legal ownership, but in terms of public expectation. "So what do we do?" he asked. Evelyn was silent for a moment, her hands moving over the deer's abdomen. "We keep them safe, for as long as we can, and then we make the hard choice." "What choice?" "Whether to let them go back into the wild or keep them in protective custody." The fawn was stronger, not by much, but enough that Evelyn's expression softened when she examined her. The little one had nursed throughout the night, and her legs were steadier now, capable of supporting her weight for short periods. Her coat had dried into soft, pale fur that caught the morning light like spun silk. "She's gaining ground," Evelyn said, running her hands gently over the fawn's ribs. "But she's still underweight. In the wild, she'd be an easy target. Coyotes, eagles, even foxes would see her as prey. And the mother, exhausted, dehydrated. She needs rest, water, and food. But more than that, she needs safety. If we release them now, I'd give them less than a week." Daniel felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. "So we keep them here? For now, until the fawn is strong enough to run. Until the mother recovers her strength." "But Daniel," Evelyn's eyes met his, serious and sad. "We can't keep them forever. They're wild animals. They belong out there, not in a parking lot surrounded by people." By mid-morning, a plan had begun to take shape. Daniel contacted his supervisor at the Wildlife Service, a gruff man named Tom Hendricks, who'd spent 30 years managing everything from bear relocations to elk population control. Tom listened to the situation, asked a few pointed questions, and then went silent for a long moment. "You're telling me a wild deer walked up to humans and asked for help delivering her fawn?" Tom said finally, his voice flat with disbelief. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Another pause. "And the fawn survived?" "Yes." "Jesus, Daniel, do you have any idea what kind of attention this is going to bring?" "I'm aware. That's why I need your help. We need a controlled environment. Somewhere safe, quiet, away from crowds, just until they're strong enough." Tom sighed heavily. "There's the old rehabilitation pen near Sunset Ridge. It hasn't been used in 2 years, but it's fenced, secluded, has a water source. I can have it cleared and ready by tomorrow morning." "That's perfect. Thank you, Tom." "Don't thank me yet. Once word gets out, and it will, we're going to have every nature documentary crew and Instagram influencer in the Pacific Northwest trying to get footage. I'll do what I can to keep things under control, but you need to be prepared for this to get messy." Daniel glanced at the crowd, which had grown larger in just the past hour. "I think it already is." While Daniel coordinated logistics, Carl Whitmore took it upon himself to organize the locals. He moved through the crowd with the easy authority of someone who'd lived in these mountains his entire life, speaking in low, firm tones. "Listen up, folks," he said, gathering people near his truck. "That deer trusted us enough to ask for help. The least we can do is respect that trust. No flash photography, no sudden movements, no trying to pet the damn fawn. You want to help? Here's how. We set up a perimeter, keep gawkers at a distance, and make sure these animals feel safe." A middle-aged woman raised her hand. "What about food? Should we bring hay? Apples?" "No," Evelyn interjected, stepping forward. "Feeding wild deer can do more harm than good. Their digestive systems are sensitive. What they need right now is space and quiet." She paused, then added more gently, "But if you want to help, we could use supplies. Clean water in buckets, tarps in case it rains, blankets to block wind if the temperature drops tonight." Within an hour, people were returning with supplies. A local farmer brought bales of straw to create a soft bedding area. A young couple arrived with a generator and portable heaters. Someone even set up a canopy to provide shade as the day grew warmer. The white deer watched it all with those strange pink eyes, alert but calm, as though she understood that these humans were trying to help her family. Around noon, the first complication arrived. Daniel was coordinating with 2 other rangers to prepare for the transport when Marissa came running from the visitor center, her face pale. "Daniel, we have a problem." He turned, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. "What is it?" "There's a group on social media. They're calling this animal exploitation. They're saying we should leave the deer alone, that human intervention is unnatural, and they're organizing a protest. They're planning to come here this afternoon." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling a headache building behind his temples. "Of course they are," Evelyn overheard and stepped closer. "What are they demanding?" Marissa pulled up her phone, scrolling through posts. They want us to release the deer immediately. They're saying that keeping them here, even for medical reasons, is equivalent to captivity. They're calling it," she squinted at the screen, "speciesism and wildlife imprisonment." Carl snorted. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week, and I watch cable news." But Daniel wasn't laughing. He'd dealt with protests before, well-meaning people whose passions sometimes outpaced their understanding of wildlife management. The problem was, they could create chaos. And chaos was the last thing the deer needed right now. "How many are coming?" he asked. "The event page says 60 people have marked attending. But you know how that goes. Could be 10, could be 100. Daniel looked at the white deer, who was resting peacefully with her fawn tucked against her side. Both animals had finally found a moment of peace after the trauma of birth, and now that peace was about to be shattered. "We move them," he said decisively. "Today. Before the protesters arrive, we get them to Sunset Ridge, where they'll have privacy and safety. Tom said tomorrow, but we can't wait." Evelyn frowned. "Daniel, they're not ready for transport. The stress alone could. The stress of being surrounded by a screaming mob will be worse. Trust me." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. But we do this carefully, slowly. And if at any point the mother shows signs of distress, we stop." Agreed. Agreed. The next 3 hours were a carefully choreographed dance of preparation. Tom expedited the rehabilitation pen setup, calling in favors to have a team clear brush and repair fencing. Daniel and 2 other rangers prepared a specialized trailer, essentially a large padded enclosure on wheels designed for transporting injured wildlife. The tricky part would be convincing the mother deer to enter it. "She walked up to us once," Daniel said, studying the animal. "Maybe she'll trust us again. Or maybe she used up all her trust getting us to help with the birth," Evelyn countered. "We need to be ready for resistance." Carl stepped forward, pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was an old harmonica, scratched and worn. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked. "Something my grandfather taught me," Carl said. He raised the harmonica to his lips and began to play, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to drift through the air like smoke. It wasn't quite a lullaby, not quite a hymn, but something in between. The white deer's ears pricked forward. She lifted her head, listening. Carl played for nearly a minute, then lowered the harmonica. "My grandfather was a Yakima elder. He used to say that music is a universal language. Animals, humans, doesn't matter. We all understand it." "Did it work?" Marissa whispered. They were about to find out. Daniel approached the trailer, which had been positioned with its rear doors open. He moved slowly, speaking in the same soft, steady voice he'd used during the birth. "Come on, girl. We're going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere you and your baby can rest." The mother deer watched him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she stood. The fawn scrambled to her feet, wobbling but determined, and together, mother and daughter took their first steps toward the trailer. The mother deer stood at the entrance to the trailer, her white form stark against the dark interior. She turned her head back toward her fawn, who bleated softly, uncertain. For a moment that stretched into eternity, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the fawn took a tentative step forward, and another. She walked on shaky legs toward her mother, and when she reached the trailer's ramp, the mother deer turned and walked inside. Daniel felt something break open in his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. "Close it," Evelyn said quietly. Slowly, 2 rangers moved forward and carefully secured the trailer doors. Through the ventilation slats, they could see the white deer settling onto the padded floor, her fawn curling against her. She looked exhausted but calm, as though she understood this was necessary. "Let's move," Daniel said, climbing into the truck's cab. "We have maybe an hour before those protesters arrive." But they had less time than that. They were 10 minutes down the forest road when Marissa's voice crackled over the radio. "Daniel, they're here. The protesters just pulled into the parking lot. At least 40 of them, maybe more." Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "How are they acting?" "Angry, confused. They're demanding to know where the deer is. Some of them are saying we kidnapped her." Behind Daniel, in the vehicle escorting the trailer, Evelyn's voice came through, "Just keep driving. We're committed now." But 5 minutes later, 3 cars appeared in Daniel's rearview mirror, coming fast. "Damn it," he muttered. The lead car, a silver sedan, pulled alongside the trailer, and a young man leaned out the passenger window, holding a megaphone. "Stop the vehicle! You're transporting an animal against her will." Daniel grabbed his radio. "Tom, I need backup on Forest Road 47. We've got protesters trying to intercept the transport." "Copy that. I've got 2 units heading your way, ETA 15 minutes. "We don't have 15 minutes, Daniel said through gritted teeth. The sedan swerved in front of the trailer, brake lights flashing. Daniel had to slow down or risk collision. The convoy came to a crawl, then a stop. Within seconds, protesters had surrounded the vehicles. Signs materialized: "Free the white deer," and "Wildlife not welfare," and "Nature doesn't need saving." Daniel stepped out of the truck, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Everyone, please step back. This animal is in medical distress. We're transporting her to a safe location where she can recover." A woman in her 30s pushed to the front, her face flushed with righteous anger. "You don't get to decide what's best for her. She's a wild animal. She belongs in the forest, not in a cage." "She's not going to a cage," Evelyn said, emerging from the escort vehicle. "She's going to a rehabilitation area, temporary, until she and her fawn are strong enough to survive on their own." "You're traumatizing her," another protester shouted. "Can't you see you're making it worse?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Carl's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "That deer walked up to us and asked for help." The crowd turned. Carl stood near the trailer, his weathered face set in hard lines. "You weren't there," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much to tolerate nonsense. "You didn't see her in labor, dying, desperate. She came to us, not the other way around, and we helped her bring her baby into this world. Now you want to lecture us about what's best for her. Where the hell were you when she needed someone?" the woman faltered. "That's not... We're trying to protect her from exploitation, from people who want to turn her into a tourist attraction." "We don't want that either," Daniel said firmly. "Look, I understand your concern, I do, but right now this deer needs medical care. Her fawn is underweight and vulnerable. In the wild, they wouldn't last 3 days. All we're asking for is a chance to give them that chance, and then, when they're ready, we'll release them back where they belong." "How do we know you're telling the truth?" someone called from the back. "Because I'm inviting you to see for yourselves," Daniel said. "Not all of you. We can't have a crowd. But I'll allow 2 representatives to come to the rehabilitation area. You can observe the conditions, verify that the animals are being treated humanely, and you can be there when we release them." The protesters exchanged uncertain glances. The woman who'd been leading the charge looked torn, her conviction warring with the logic of Daniel's offer. "I'll go," she said finally, "and I'm bringing a camera." "Fair enough," Daniel said. "Now please move your vehicles. Every minute we stand here arguing is another minute these animals are stressed and suffering." Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. The silver sedan pulled off to the side of the road. The convoy started moving again, but they'd lost precious time, and the fawn, stressed by the noise and commotion, had begun to bleat frantically inside the trailer. By the time they reached the rehabilitation pen at Sunset Ridge, the sun was past its zenith and the temperature had climbed into the low 70s. The pen was larger than Daniel had expected, nearly an acre, enclosed by tall wooden fencing designed to be visible enough to contain, but natural enough not to terrify. Inside, there was a small shelter, a water trough that fed from a natural spring, and enough native vegetation to provide both food and cover. Tom Hendricks was waiting at the gate, his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between relief and exasperation. "About time," he said. "I was starting to think you'd been eaten by activists." "Close," Daniel muttered. They opened the trailer carefully, giving the mother deer time to assess her surroundings. She emerged slowly, her pink eyes scanning the enclosure. The fawn stumbled out behind her, legs trembling. For a long moment, the white deer stood perfectly still, processing this new environment. Then she walked toward the water trough, lowered her head, and drank deeply. The fawn followed, mimicking her mother's movements. "She approves," Evelyn said quietly, relief evident in her voice. For the next several hours, they monitored the deer from a discreet observation post Tom had set up at the edge of the pen. The mother explored the enclosure methodically, investigating every corner, every shadow. She was checking for threats, for escape routes, for anything that might endanger her fawn. The two protesters Daniel had allowed, the woman whose name was Jennifer and a quiet man with a camera named Marcus, watched in silence. "She seems calm," Jennifer admitted. Her earlier anger softened into something more like cautious observation. "She's exhausted," Evelyn corrected. "But yes, she's accepting the space. That's a good sign." Marcus filmed everything, his camera capturing the way the mother deer finally settled beneath the shelter, her fawn nursing contentedly. "This is incredible," he murmured. "I've never seen anything like this." "Most people haven't," Daniel said. "That's what makes it special, and that's why we have to protect them, not just from predators, but from people who mean well but don't understand what these animals actually need." Jennifer looked at him, and for the first time, her expression held something like respect. "I'm sorry," she said, "for blocking the road. We thought you were exploiting her." "I know," Daniel said. "And I'm glad people care enough to get angry, but caring and understanding aren't always the same thing." As evening approached, Carl played his harmonica again, the notes drifting through the air like a benediction. The white deer lifted her head, listening, and something in her posture seemed to relax, as though the music touched some ancient memory, some place where humans and animals existed without fear. The fawn took her first confident steps in the rehabilitation pen, wobbling less now, her legs gaining strength with each passing hour. She explored the perimeter, her nose twitching at new scents, her ears swiveling at new sounds. And always, her mother watched, vigilant and protective. Just before sunset, something extraordinary happened. The buck appeared. He stood on the far side of the fence, his massive antlers silhouetted against the orange sky. He'd tracked them somehow, followed his family across miles of forest to this place. The mother deer walked to the fence. The buck lowered his head, and they touched noses through the wooden slats, a gesture so tender, so unmistakably intimate, that everyone watching fell silent. "He won't leave her," Carl said softly. "He'll stay close. Protect them from out there while we protect them in here." And he was right. As night fell and the humans retreated to let the deer rest, the buck remained, a silent sentinel just beyond the fence, keeping watch over his family. That night, sleeping in shifts at the observation post, the team faced a new challenge. Around 2 in the morning, Evelyn's phone buzzed with an alert. She checked it, frowned, and immediately woke Daniel. "We have a problem," she said. "Weather Service just issued a severe storm warning, heavy rain, possible flash flooding. The creek that feeds the water trough could overflow." Daniel was on his feet instantly. "How long do we have?" "Storm's moving fast, maybe 3 hours." They woke Tom and Carl, and within 20 minutes they were working by flashlight to reinforce the shelter, dig drainage trenches, and create barriers to redirect potential floodwater away from the pen. The sky, which had been clear at sunset, was now choked with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. The first drops began to fall at 3:47 a.m. Within minutes, it was a deluge. The rain came down in sheets, turning the ground to mud within minutes. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling through the mountains like artillery. Inside the pen, the white deer stood over her fawn, shielding the tiny body with her own. "The creek's rising," Tom shouted over the storm. "If it breaches, it'll flood the lower half of the pen." Daniel grabbed a shovel and joined Carl at the drainage trench they'd dug, working frantically to deepen it, to give the water somewhere to go. Evelyn was inside the pen itself, risky but necessary, trying to coax the deer toward higher ground, but the mother wouldn't move. She'd chosen this spot for her fawn, and she wasn't leaving it. "Stubborn animal," Evelyn muttered, then louder, "Come on, Mama, you have to move, it's not safe here." The creek crested its banks. Water began pouring into the pen, rushing toward the shelter where the deer stood. Daniel made a split-second decision. He vaulted over the fence, against every protocol, against every safety regulation, and ran toward the deer. "Daniel, no!" Evelyn screamed. But he was already there. He positioned himself between the water and the fawn, using his own body as a barrier, and he began to dig with his bare hands, creating a berm to redirect the flow. The mother deer could have bolted, could have attacked. Instead, she stayed, and together, man and animal, they fought the flood. Carl joined him, then Tom, then Evelyn, all of them, soaked and exhausted, working in the dark and the rain to save two animals that most of the world would never even know existed. And slowly, impossibly, the water began to recede. The drainage trenches held, the creek fell back within its banks, the storm passed. As dawn broke, pale and grey through the dissipating clouds, Daniel sat in the mud, his back against the shelter wall, utterly spent. The white deer stood 3 feet away, her fawn sleeping peacefully at her side. She looked at him with those strange pink eyes, and Daniel could have sworn, though he'd never admit it out loud, that she nodded, just once. A gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude. "You're welcome," he whispered. Behind him, Carl was laughing, a deep, exhausted sound full of wonder. "That," he said, "is a hell of a story." "That," Evelyn corrected, pulling herself to her feet, "is a hell of a family." And somewhere beyond the fence, barely visible in the morning mist, the buck stood watch, faithful and unwavering as he had been all night. The week following the storm marked a transformation, not just for the deer, but for everyone who'd been part of their story. The fawn, whom Marissa had unofficially named Hope, despite Evelyn's protests about anthropomorphizing wildlife, gained weight steadily. Her legs grew stronger each day, and by the 4th morning she was running, awkward, bouncing gallops that sent her careening into fence posts and her mother's legs, but running nonetheless. Her coat had darkened slightly, settling into a cream color that would help her blend better into the forest than her mother's stark white. The mother deer, too, was recovering. The hollows beneath her ribs filled out, her breathing steadied. The wariness in her eyes remained. She was, after all, still a wild animal. But there was something else there now, something Daniel couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or trust earned through shared survival. The buck never left. He'd claimed the ridge overlooking the rehabilitation pen as his territory, and anyone approaching would see him standing sentinel among the pines. Tom had tried to track him once, out of professional curiosity, but the buck had melted into the forest like smoke. Yet every morning and evening, there he was, watching over his family. The story had spread far beyond the local community. Jennifer and Marcus's footage had gone viral, not the sensational kind of viral, but the quiet, profound kind that makes people pause in their scrolling. News outlets from Seattle to Portland picked it up. A wildlife documentary crew from National Geographic reached out, offering to film a special. Tom's phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, permits to visit, questions about the miracle deer. Daniel turned down most of them. But he did agree to one, a visit from a class of 3rd graders from the elementary school in Ridgefield. They arrived on a Thursday morning, 28 children bursting with questions and barely contained energy. Their teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Chen, had prepared them extensively. They knew not to shout, not to run, not to treat the deer like a petting zoo attraction. Daniel gathered them at the observation post, where they could see the pen from a distance without disturbing its inhabitants. "Why is she white?" a small boy asked immediately, his hand shooting up. "She's albino," Daniel explained. "It's a genetic condition that means her body doesn't produce the pigment that gives animals their normal coloring. It's very rare. In the wild, animals like her usually don't survive long because they're so easy for predators to spot. But she survived, a girl with braids said solemnly. She's strong. She is, Daniel agreed, but she's also smart. She knew when to ask for help. Do animals really understand humans? Another child asked. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. I think animals are smarter than we give them credit for. They notice patterns. They remember who's helped them and who's hurt them. Did this deer understand English? No. But did she understand that humans could help her when she was in trouble? I think somehow she did. Mrs. Chen spoke up. Class, we talked about what Mr. Reeves and Dr. Lanning did. Can someone tell me why this was an unusual situation? Several hands went up. A quiet boy in the back said, because usually we're supposed to leave wild animals alone. But this time, the animal needed help, and humans knew how to give it without making things worse. Exactly, Evelyn said, joining the group. She'd been preparing food supplements inside the pen. In wildlife rehabilitation, we have a saying, observe, assess, act only when necessary, and always with the goal of returning the animal to the wild. This deer and her fawn won't live here forever. This is temporary, just until they're strong enough and safe enough to go back where they belong. When will that be? The girl with braids asked, and there was genuine sadness in her voice. Soon, Daniel said, and the word felt heavier than it should. That evening, after the children had left, Daniel and Evelyn sat at the observation post with coffee that had long since gone cold. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Inside the pen, the fawn was nursing while her mother watched the tree line where the buck had just appeared for his evening vigil. She's ready, Evelyn said quietly. Physically, at least. The fawn's hit all the developmental markers. She can run, she's nursing well, and she's starting to forage on her own. The mother's back to full strength. By every measurable standard, they're ready for release. But, Daniel prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice, but I'm worried about what happens after. She's been protected here. The fawn has never known danger. And that white coat, Evelyn shook her head. In a perfect world, they'd have a fighting chance. In reality, I'd give them 6 months before something finds them. Maybe less. So what do you suggest? Keep them here permanently? No, God, no. That would be its own kind of cruelty. They're wild animals, Daniel. They need to be wild. She set down her coffee cup and turned to face him. But I think we need to give them the best possible chance. That means releasing them somewhere remote, away from roads and hunting zones. Somewhere the mother knows, where she has established territory. And it means doing it in spring, when resources are abundant and the fawn has time to learn survival skills before winter. That gives us 3 more weeks. Yes, Daniel looked at the white deer, who had turned her head to gaze in their direction, her pink eyes catching the last of the sunlight. 3 more weeks with creatures who had walked out of the forest and into his life, changing everything he thought he understood about the boundaries between human and animal, domestic and wild, intervention and interference. 3 weeks, he repeated. Then we let them go. The transformation wasn't just happening with the deer. Carl Whitmore, the retired logger who'd first reported seeing the white deer years ago, had become a fixture at the rehabilitation site. He showed up every morning with coffee and stories, and every evening with his harmonica. He'd started teaching Daniel about tracking, about reading animal sign, about the old ways of moving through the forest with respect rather than dominance. My grandfather used to say that every animal is a teacher, Carl said one afternoon, as they reinforced a section of fence. You just have to be willing to learn. What's this one teaching us? Daniel asked. Carl was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands working the fence wire with practiced ease. That trust is a gift, he said finally, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Marissa, too, had changed. The young volunteer who'd first called Daniel in a panic had become one of the deer's most dedicated advocates. She'd taken over managing the social media presence, carefully curating what information was shared and what was kept private. She'd organized a fundraiser that brought in enough money to cover the rehabilitation costs and establish a fund for future emergency wildlife care. She'd found her calling in those frantic hours, and it showed in everything she did. Even Jennifer, the protester who'd blocked their convoy, had become an ally. She'd spent days at the site, observing, learning, asking questions. Her anger had transformed into genuine curiosity about wildlife management, and she'd started volunteering at Evelyn's clinic. "I was wrong," she'd admitted to Daniel one day. "I thought caring meant not interfering, but sometimes caring means knowing when to act and when to step back. That's harder. It requires actually understanding the situation instead of just having opinions about it." On the 15th day, something shifted. The mother deer had been growing restless, pacing the fence line at dusk and dawn. The fawn, sensing her mother's energy, had become more adventurous, testing the boundaries of the pen, calling out toward the forest where her father watched. "They're ready to go home," Carl said, watching the white deer's movements. "She's telling us," Evelyn agreed. "The fawn's strong. She's been practicing her running, her jumping. She's learned to forage. Behaviorally, they're both ready. And you're right, keeping them longer serves us, not them." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with logic or wildlife management protocol. He'd known this moment was coming, had known it from the beginning, but knowing didn't make it easier. Tom Hendricks arrived that afternoon with a team to discuss the release plan. They spread maps across the hood of his truck, marking potential sites. "Here," Tom said, pointing to a remote valley 20 miles north. "It's the white deer's home range. She was spotted there multiple times before she came to us. There's water, cover, food sources, and it's within the protected wilderness area. No hunting, minimal human traffic." "What about predators?" Evelyn asked. "They're everywhere. There's no safe zone, not really, but this area has healthy prey populations, which means predators are well fed and less likely to take unnecessary risks. It's as good as we can offer." Daniel studied the map, his finger tracing the contours of the land. "When?" "Dawn, 3 days from now. We give them the weekend, release early Monday before the week's traffic picks up. We'll have rangers stationed at access points to keep people away. The transport will be quick, less than an hour, and then—" Tom looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Then we let nature take its course." That night, Daniel stayed late at the observation post. He wasn't scheduled to be there. Carl was on watch, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, and in its light the white deer seemed to glow, spectral and impossible. The fawn slept curled against her mother, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. The mother deer was awake, her head raised, her ears swiveling to catch every sound. She was listening to the forest, to the call of the wild that had never really left her. "You're going home," Daniel said quietly, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping she might understand the tone. "And I hope you find safety there. I hope your baby grows strong. I hope whoever sees you in the forest remembers that you're special, that you deserve to live, that the world is better with you in it." The white deer turned her head and looked directly at him. For a long moment their eyes met, human and animal, two beings who'd shared something profound and fleeting, something that couldn't be captured in photographs or explained in interviews. Then she lowered her head and nuzzled her sleeping fawn, and Daniel understood that she was already saying goodbye. He wiped his eyes quickly, grateful for the darkness, and whispered, "Thank you for trusting us, for letting us be part of your story." Behind him, Carl's voice was gentle. "She'll be all right, you know. She's a survivor." "I know," Daniel said, though his voice caught on the words. "I just wish we could guarantee it." "Nothing's guaranteed," Carl said, settling into the chair beside him. "Not for them, not for us. All we can do is give them the best chance we can, and then have faith." Din. They sat together in the moonlight. Two men keeping watch over a family of deer, honoring the brief, beautiful intersection of human and wild, knowing that in 3 days it would end, and knowing, too, that they'd carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. The morning of the release arrived cold and clear. Dawn broke over the Cascade Range in layers of gold and pink, the air so crisp it seemed to crystallize with each breath. Daniel arrived at the rehabilitation pen before first light, unable to sleep, unable to stay away. The white deer was already awake, standing at the fence facing north toward the valley that had been her home. The fawn stood beside her, mimicking her mother's posture, both of them silhouetted against the emerging day like figures from a dream. Evelyn arrived moments later, followed by Tom, Carl, and Marissa. They moved quietly, speaking in whispers, as though anything louder might shatter the sanctity of what was about to happen. "The transport's ready," Tom said. "Rangers are in position at all the access points. We have a clear window, 2 hours before any hikers might be on the trails." Daniel nodded, his throat too tight for words. They'd decided against tranquilizing the deer. The risk was too high, especially for the fawn. Instead, they would rely on what had worked before: trust, patience, and Carl's harmonica. Carl took his position near the pen's gate, raised the instrument to his lips, and began to play. The melody was different this time, not the lullaby he'd played during the birth, but something that sounded like a farewell, bittersweet and beautiful. The white deer's ears swiveled forward. She turned from the fence and walked toward the gate, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The fawn followed, her steps confident now, no longer the wobbly stumbles of a newborn, but the purposeful gait of a young deer coming into her own. Evelyn opened the gate slowly, and the deer walked through without hesitation, as though she'd been waiting for this moment, as though she understood that freedom was on the other side of trust. The transport took 40 minutes, the trailer moving carefully over the forest roads that led deep into the protected wilderness. Daniel rode in the escort vehicle, his eyes fixed on the trailer ahead, his mind full of everything he wanted to say and couldn't. When they reached the release site, a meadow bordered by thick pine forest with a creek running along its eastern edge, the sun had fully risen, illuminating the valley in brilliant morning light. Tom, Daniel, Evelyn, Carl, and Marissa gathered near the trailer. On the ridge above, 2 other rangers stood watch, ensuring privacy. This moment belonged to the deer, not to cameras or crowds. "Last chance to change our minds," Tom said quietly, though everyone knew he didn't mean it. "She came to us asking for help," Daniel said. "Now we honor that trust by letting her go." Evelyn approached the trailer and opened the doors slowly, then stepped back to give the deer space. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the white deer emerged, stepping into the sunlight, into her home territory, into freedom. She paused at the edge of the trailer, her pink eyes scanning the meadow, the forest, the creek, cataloguing everything, assessing safety, remembering. The fawn came next, bounding down the ramp with the reckless enthusiasm of youth. She took 3 leaping steps into the grass, then stopped and looked back at her mother, as if asking, "Is this real? Can we stay?" The white deer made a low rumbling sound, a call of reassurance, and together they walked into the meadow. They didn't run immediately. The mother deer moved through the grass methodically, stopping to smell the air, to listen, to orient herself in a landscape she'd known before her desperate journey to find human help. The fawn stayed close, learning by watching, absorbing the lessons that would keep her alive. Daniel watched, his chest aching with a mixture of joy and loss. This was the right thing, the only thing, but that didn't make it hurt less. "Look," Marissa whispered, pointing toward the tree line. The buck emerged from the shadows of the pines. He'd been waiting patient and faithful, and now his family was home. He approached slowly, and when he reached the white deer, they touched noses in that same tender gesture they'd shared through the fence. The fawn bounded toward her father, and he lowered his massive head to nuzzle her, welcoming his daughter to the wild. For several minutes, the 3 deer stood together in the meadow, mother, father, and fawn, a family reunited against all odds. Then, as if responding to some signal only they could hear, They turned as one and began walking toward the forest. "Wait," Carl said suddenly. He raised his harmonica one last time and played a single sustained note, a goodbye, a blessing, a promise that not all humans were hunters. The white deer stopped. She turned her head and looked back at the group of humans standing beside the empty trailer. Her pink eyes found Daniel's, and for the last time they shared that inexplicable connection, that recognition of one living being by another, across the divide of species and language and understanding. Then she turned away and walked into the forest, her family following, and the shadows swallowed them whole. They stood in silence for a long time after the deer disappeared. Daniel realized his face was wet, and he didn't bother to wipe the tears away. Beside him, Marissa was openly crying. Evelyn's eyes were red-rimmed. Even Tom, gruff and professional, had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Well," he said finally, his voice rough, "I'd say that's a successful release." Carl tucked his harmonica into his pocket. Successful doesn't even begin to cover it. They packed up slowly, reluctant to leave, as though by staying they could somehow protect the deer from whatever came next. But they couldn't. That was the truth of it. The hard, beautiful truth. They'd done what they could. They'd answered the call for help. They'd given the deer and her fawn a chance. The rest was up to nature, to fate, to whatever forces govern the lives of wild things in wild places. As they drove away from the valley, Daniel looked back one last time. The meadow was empty now, peaceful in the morning sun, showing no sign that anything miraculous had happened there. But he knew better. They all did. In the weeks and months that followed, there were occasional sightings. A hiker reported seeing a white deer with a cream-colored fawn near Clearwater Creek. A photographer captured a distant image of 3 deer, one white, one tawny, one pale, crossing a ridge at sunset. Carl claimed to have seen them once more in late summer and said the fawn had grown strong and confident, but there was no way to know for certain. The white deer had returned to the wild, to the mystery and danger and beauty of the forest, and that meant accepting that her story would continue beyond their ability to witness it. The rehabilitation pen at Sunset Ridge was repurposed for other animals in need. A black bear cub orphaned by a car strike, a great horned owl with a broken wing, a fox with a mangled leg. Each one was cared for, healed and released, carrying forward the legacy of compassion that had begun with a white deer who'd asked the impossible and received it. Daniel kept a single photograph on his desk. The white deer and her fawn in the meadow, moments before they'd walked into the forest. On difficult days, when the paperwork piled up and the bureaucracy of wildlife management felt suffocating, he'd look at that photograph and remember what was possible when humans chose to help instead of harm, to trust instead of fear, to honor the wild instead of trying to control it. Carl Whitmore passed away 2 years later, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, Daniel told the story of the white deer and Carl's harmonica, and how music had bridged the gap between species. "He taught us," Daniel said, "that respect and compassion aren't signs of weakness. They're the highest form of strength." Evelyn's clinic expanded, funded in part by donations inspired by the white deer's story. She trained a new generation of wildlife rehabilitators, teaching them not just the science of veterinary medicine, but the art of knowing when to intervene and when to step back, when to hold on and when to let go. Marissa went on to study wildlife biology, her path forever altered by those frantic hours when a deer had begged for help and been answered. She would tell the story to her own students one day, passing down the lesson that the boundary between human and animal is more permeable than we think, and that sometimes, in rare and precious moments, understanding flows across it like light through water. As for the white deer and her fawn, their story became legend in the forests of the Cascade Range. People spoke of them in hushed, reverent tones. The ghost deer who'd trusted humans and been proven right, the mother who'd done the unthinkable to save her baby, the fawn who'd been born into kindness and carried that knowledge into the wild. Whether they survived, whether they thrived, whether the fawn grew to adulthood and had fawns of her own, these things remained mysteries, and perhaps that was how it should be. Some stories don't need endings. Some stories are meant to continue beyond our sight, beyond our knowing, reminding us that the world is wider and wilder and more wonderful than we can ever fully comprehend. But on certain mornings, when the mist rises from Clearwater Creek and the light slants gold through the pines, hikers report seeing a flash of white among the trees, there and gone, real and impossible, a reminder that miracles walk among us. If only we have eyes to see them, and hearts brave enough to help when help is asked. And somewhere in those mountains, a family of deer moves through the forest, carrying with them a story of trust rewarded, of compassion given freely, of the fragile, fierce connection between all living things. A story that began with a desperate plea and ended with freedom. A story that reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do, human or animal, is ask for help. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that help is given. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.